Las Vegas, early 1970s. Tom Jones was 3 lines into a song he had sung hundreds of times before. And then, without warning, he stopped. The band kept playing for a beat, then faltered, the drummer's eyes flicking toward the stage. The audience, mid-applause from the song before, fell into a strange half-silence. The kind of silence that happens when several hundred people sense, all at once, that something has shifted, without anyone being able to say exactly what. Tom stood at center stage, microphone still in hand, looking toward the wings. He had performed in this showroom more nights than he could count. He knew every light cue, every entrance, every place in the room where the sound bounced differently. He did not stop mid-song. Not for technical problems, not for hecklers, not for anything. The show was the one thing that never stopped. But on this night, it did, and the reason was standing quietly in the wings, half in shadow, watching him the way very few people in that room would ever be allowed to watch anyone. Completely unannounced, completely unbothered, as if he had simply wandered backstage on his way to somewhere else. It was Dean Martin. To understand why that pause mattered, you have to understand what Las Vegas was in the early 1970s and what it meant for a performer to share that city with Dean Martin. By this point, Tom Jones was one of the biggest draws on the Strip. His residency shows sold out night after night, and the marquee outside the hotel carried his name in lights large enough to be seen from blocks away. Audiences came dressed for the occasion, furs, tuxedos, the kind of glamour that Vegas had built its reputation on. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of perfume. The showroom lit in warm gold and red, waiters moving between tables with trays held high, the orchestra tuning behind heavy curtains before the lights went down. Tom had earned his place in that world the hard way, through years of relentless touring, through a voice that could fill a room without a microphone if it had to, through a work ethic that had become, in some ways, its own kind of trap. He performed multiple shows a night, sometimes back-to-back, his schedule built around a city that never really slept, and an audience that expected every single night the same explosive energy as the night before. But Dean Martin was something different. Dean had been a fixture of Las Vegas since before most of the current crop of performers had even arrived in America. He had built his entire reputation on the opposite of what Tom did every night. Where Tom gave everything, sweat-soaked and full-throated, Dean gave the impression of giving almost nothing at all, and that was exactly the point. Dean's whole persona was built on effortlessness. A drink in one hand, a tuxedo that looked like it had been poured onto him rather than worn, a voice that could turn a room to silk without seeming to try. To the older generation of Vegas, the bosses, the old-school entertainers, the audiences who had been coming to the Strip since the 1950s, Dean Martin represented something close to royalty. He didn't need to announce himself. He didn't need an entourage trailing behind him with cameras. When Dean Martin walked into a room, people simply knew, the way you know weather is changing before it arrives. For Tom, the early 1970s were a strange kind of peak. He had everything that, a decade earlier, would have seemed impossible for a glove-cutter's son from a Welsh mining town. The residency, the television show, the records, the recognition. And yet there were nights, in the middle of all that success, when Tom felt less like a headliner and more like a machine that had been built to produce one specific output over and over, without much room for anything else. He loved performing. That part was real, and it never stopped being real. But the structure around the performing had become enormous. Every night had to be bigger than the last. Every entrance had to land. Every note had to arrive exactly where the audience expected it, because that was what they had paid for. And disappointing them was not something Tom allowed himself to consider. Underneath that, quietly, there was something else. A kind of self-consciousness that had never fully gone away, even after all the success. Tom had grown up idolizing performers exactly like Dean Martin, men who belonged to Vegas in a way that felt almost inherited, who had been part of the fabric of the city before Tom had ever set foot in America. No matter how many sold-out shows Tom had under his belt, there remained, somewhere underneath the confidence, a part of him that still felt like a young man from Pontypridd who had wandered into a room he wasn't sure he belonged in. He had met Dean before, brief encounters, polite exchanges backstage, the kind of pleasantries performers exchange in passing. But Dean had never, as far as Tom knew, come to watch one of his shows. Dean had his own residency, his own schedule, his own reputation for showing up only when he felt like it, and leaving just as easily. So when Tom looked toward the wings that night, mid-song, and saw Dean Martin standing there, not announced, not seated in a reserved booth with a spotlight on him, just standing quietly in the shadows, watching, something in Tom simply stopped working the way it normally did. The song Tom had been singing was a big one, a crowd favorite, the kind of number built for maximum impact. Horns, rising key changes, the audience clapping along by the second verse. It was the kind of song that, once started, simply carried itself forward on its own momentum. Tom could have sung it on autopilot if he'd needed to. But autopilot was exactly what broke the moment he saw Dean. For a fraction of a second, Tom's mind split in two directions. One half of him was still the performer, the professional who had sung this exact song hundreds of times, who knew the band would keep going, who knew the audience would barely notice a slight hesitation. The other half of him was, suddenly, 19 years old again, standing in front of a record player in a small house in Wales, listening to a Dean Martin record and thinking that the voice on it belonged to a different kind of person entirely. Someone from a world Tom would never actually enter. The band noticed before the audience did. The drummer's eyes went to Tom. The horn section, a beat away from their next entrance, held back, watching for a cue that didn't come. And in that strange, suspended half-second, with hundreds of people in the room, lights blazing, the orchestra poised, Tom Jones simply stopped singing. He didn't stop the show. That was the part that, looking back, surprised even Tom. Instead, he lowered the microphone slightly, turned toward the wings and, in front of the entire room, gestured toward Dean Martin, the way you might gesture toward an old friend you'd just spotted across a crowded room. He said something to the audience, something warm and a little disbelieving, along the lines of acknowledging who had just walked in, making sure the room understood who had just appeared at the edge of the stage. The audience, who moments before had been confused by the pause, suddenly understood it completely. A wave of applause rose up, first scattered, then full, as people craned their necks to see toward the wings. Some stood. The orchestra, sensing the shift, began to play something different. A few warm bars, almost a tribute, before settling back toward where the song had left off. Dean, for his part, did what Dean always did. He didn't step into the light. He didn't take a bow. He simply raised one hand, gave a small, easy wave. The kind of wave that said he hadn't meant to interrupt anything, that he'd just been passing through and had stopped to listen for a moment. And the room, somehow, loved him even more for not making a thing of it. Tom picked the song back up almost exactly where he'd left it. The band found their place again. To anyone watching without context, the pause might have looked like nothing more than a performer acknowledging a celebrity in the crowd, a common enough occurrence in Vegas. But for Tom, something had happened in those few seconds that had nothing to do with showmanship. For just a moment, the machine, the schedule, the expectations, the relentless nightly performance had fallen away, and underneath it had been something simpler. A young singer from Wales, genuinely moved, genuinely surprised, genuinely unable to keep singing as if nothing had changed, because for him, something had. After the show, Dean didn't linger. He came backstage briefly. The two of them exchanged a few words. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made it into any official account of the night. Dean told Tom, in his characteristic understated way, that he'd enjoyed the show, that he'd happened to be walking past and had decided to stick around for a song or two. Then he was gone, off to wherever he'd been heading before he'd wandered into the wings. For Dean, it was a small gesture, probably forgotten by the time he reached the parking lot. For Tom, it stayed. In the years that followed, as Tom's career continued, through the rest of the Vegas years, through the changes the industry would go through decades of performances on stages far larger than that showroom, he would occasionally think back to that pause. Not because of what was said, which was almost nothing, but because of what the pause itself had revealed, that no matter how big the show became, no matter how many nights in a row he performed, there were still moments that could catch him completely off guard. Moments where the performer disappeared, just for a second, and what was left was simply a person, reacting honestly to something that mattered to him. It is a small story in the end. No scandal, no tension, nothing that changed the trajectory of either man's career. Dean Martin went on being Dean Martin. Tom Jones went on filling that showroom night after night, the residency continuing much as it had before. But the story has stayed, in a quiet way, among the people who were in that room, a memory of a night when the city's biggest current draw stopped mid-song because its most effortless legend had wandered in to listen, and for a few seconds neither of them pretended otherwise. It said something about Las Vegas in that era, a city that, for all its glitter and excess, still ran on something more human underneath. Respect, passing quietly between performers in moments too small to be part of any official story, but too real for the people who saw them to ever quite forget.